remind this audience of the question that you shared last night that was asked of the Finnish students that they had to write on.
Oh, right. So
just tell them the question, and then I'm gonna tell how I responded back to you.
Yeah, it's a university entrance exam that comes at the end of high school, and one of the essay questions was, "Why has there been no lasting peace in the Middle East?" And they write all day for like 5 hours.
Yeah. So I retorted last night to Amanda. A couple nights ago, I saw one of my 9th grade sons bring home a world geography question, name the 7 continents. So why does that happen?
I know, especially because you can Google that. You cannot Google why has there been no last. I mean, you can. Like, I'm going to get a straight answer, right? So this is something that comes up again and again. When I surveyed hundreds of exchange students, 9 out of 10 said their classes in the US were easier. These are international students who've gone to public high school and lived here. And so then I thought that was kind of anti-Americanism. You know, they think we're dumb, whatever. So then I surveyed American exchange students who've lived abroad and gone to high school abroad. And 7 out of 10 Americans said their US classes were easier. So it is something that runs through not just the data, but also the qualitative interviews of kids. Less than half of kids say they are challenged in their academic classes by high school. Now maybe they're just saying that, I don't know. I mean, it's certainly part of the problem is kids push back on rigorous work, and sometimes their parents back them up, right? Because we have yet to build a really clear consensus around the reality that kids need to engage in routine failure to learn. That's okay and actually necessary. So there is a kind of lag, I think, in our culture catching up with the economic realities of our time, which are going to require a kind of ruthless meritocracy, whether we like it or not.
So do you think we've lost courage? Like when I visit schools, and I totally agree with you that it all starts with the principal. And I like the A+ staff is so tired of me complaining about the lack of courage on the part of America's principals. Why do you think we've lost courage?
I don't know. I mean,
to meet up with rigor and conquer it?
Yeah, I feel like it's less about courage and more like we have lost faith in our kids. You have to have high expectations you have to believe kids are capable of dealing with failure. And I actually think sometimes we impose our own experiences on kids. Like the other day I was in my office and we have a new coffee maker, and I was like, oh man, what is happening here? It just threw me for a loop, and I was trying to figure out the different buttons, and I was like, what the heck? And this kid came up and he was like, pretend you're my 18-month-old nephew. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, because this is his whole life is like this. And he pushes buttons until it works. And I was like, oh, you're right. Kids are much better. So I was talking last night about how in Japan, Elizabeth Green has a great new book out called Building a Better Teacher. Outstanding book, gets at this notion of giving teachers time to learn and master their craft. But she showed me a video the other day that she took at a Japanese elementary school. It was really her first school visit in Japan. And it was at recess. And there were 1,000 kids just running around in this huge playground, so empty sort of square. And there were only 2 kinds of toys. And one was a unicycle, and the other was stilts. And these little kids are running around these unicycles and stilts. And she was like, what is going on here? And there's one adult. Because you know what the teachers are? Planning for their next lesson, right? They are not standing out there hovering over the kids. Anyway, but the fact that they had unicycles and stilts reflects something bigger. That they think the kids can handle it. Better than I could, for sure. Right? And then they also think kids can handle dealing with complex math and struggling with it, as long as they believe they can get better with more work and more help. That's really important, right? To have that mindset combined with productive struggle. So I think look, this is partly a reaction to economic success, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, it's a very tough country. Like, people here work very hard, and they always have, I mean, this is a country with a lot of innovation, a lot of optimism, which is hugely important, and a lot of individualism, which is also hugely important. The ability to break with the norms when you need to. That's not true in a lot of other countries. So we have a lot of strengths, but economically, we have not needed for kids to master rigorous math. We haven't needed that until recently.
Yeah. Okay, so here's my last question, and then we'll go to the audience. I think didn't you have 3 things that top class schools do, right?
Yes, that
Yeah.
to look for?
Watch kids,
Yeah.
talk
Talk
to
to
kids.
the principal, talk to kids, and watch kids, yeah.
So why don't we do what we know what to do?
And this gets back to the question.
I'm not asking you easy questions.
I can answer this. The answer is Z. I can answer this stuff. This gets back to the question about courage. Like, I actually think in the defense of principles, I mean, there's so much noise in U.S. education debates. I mean, this is part of the challenge in finding a world-class school for your own kid. You talk to one parent, you hear one very compelling narrative about what's happening at that school. You talk to another parent, you hear literally the opposite. Both very compelling. And then you hear another from another parent, and then you hear another from a teacher, and another from a student. And it's partly there's so much noise because we don't have a consensus around rigorous learning. So there's not a clear priority. Like, we want schools to do a lot of things. We want them to build self-esteem, and we want them to have a yearbook and track and French club, and we want them to also do rigorous academic learning and all these other things we want them to do, right? So that lack of focus is a huge challenge for the U.S. And something that we didn't talk about here, but we talked about last night. I mean, in these other countries, sports is not part of school. Kids play sports, of course, all over the world kids like sports, but they do pickup games on their own, they do things through like rec centers, boys and girls clubs type things, but it's not part of school. So what does that mean? That means principals in Finland spend no time dealing with athletic budgets, finding insurance, getting buses, subs, referees, all the many things that high school principals in America have to deal with every day. So focus in any complex organization, right, private or public, is so important. So that's something I think some schools, very few, but some schools are realizing and starting to say no to a lot of things. Starting to say, we're not gonna have a football team. I know this maybe sacrilegious for me to say that, but
watch it.
maybe we should move on.
No, and then we're going to go to the first question, but you showed that picture of Gettysburg High School, and what I was thinking is, so Houston just passed a $1.2 billion bond, and I think a lot of people thought, so are we building big schools, or what do we need to use that money for, right? All right, let's go to the first question.
Well, what are they going to use the money for, do you know?
I think they're going to build big buildings.
So all over the world, spending the money on people is actually a much better investment. If you could just tell them that.
Yeah, I'll pass that. Maybe I'm not the right person to do that. I might not be the right person to pass that on. First question.
All right, thank you. I'm a homeschooling parent, teacher, and I noticed that in this presentation we didn't hear much about nutrition. And one of the most important things that I do at my homeschool is emphasize sleep, good food, and hydration. And throughout the world, kids are waking up very early, and they're not allowed to wake up naturally. And there are some serious consequences to that, from attention deficit to falling asleep in class, etc. And so I'm wondering, where does nutrition come into this conversation? For me, that's the most important. Letting the children sleep naturally, not waking them up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I cook all their meals from scratch as well, so feeding them good food so that they can perform at their best.
Right.
And so my question is, where does nutrition come into this conversation?
So I get asked this fairly often. It's a good question. I mean, obviously, these things are really, it's awesome that you're able to do that for your kids, and that it does definitely, we know, right? I mean, you don't have to be a scientist to know that this leads to healthy kids. We also know that even in countries that do a lot of that, they don't necessarily have strong education systems. So what you want is both, right? I mean, ideally. What you see, for Italy, for example, Italy, there's not been a lot of research, but there was a great study that looked at school lunch around the world. And I was like, this is fascinating, whatever. And so I was reading it and geeking out on it. And this thing, I mean, I've been to Italy, I have not visited schools and inspected the school lunch. Obviously that's oversight on my point. But the report, I didn't visit Italy because Italy does not have good education outcomes, okay? So, but the report was like, the children eat locally grown vegetables with real cutlery on tablecloths because Italians, I mean, who knows if this is all right, but it was saying that Italians feel this is important and so forth. And the French also, you know, really value sort of food and civilized eating, which is great. And it's in some ways a more civilized country and healthy country because of that. But it doesn't necessarily lead to learning, right? Which would make sense to you, I'm sure. It is important, and I think that's something that more of our districts are, not very many, but some districts are now moving to all free lunch, right? So that it's not a stigma, and that if they have a certain kind of quorum of free and reduced price lunch kids, it's just everybody gets free lunch. And that's what Finland does. Not all schools do that, even in high performing countries, but I think that would sort of be the ideal model so that you knew you're at least doing whatever you can that's easy, relatively easy to do, to help kids be ready to learn. Because the hard work is in the teaching, and if kids are hungry, you know, that makes it harder.
And my health club has a sign, junk food is the new cigarette. But I bet kids in like the high performing countries eat junk food too.
I was just thinking there should be an e-junk food cigarette, like you could, that would be awesome if I could just eat like e-chips. But anyway, to answer your question, don't tell anyone that idea. I'm not kidding. To answer your question, yes, kids in other countries eat junk food. But the one difference I did notice is that it's not as available to kids. I mean, that's true for adults too. You know, if you go to other countries, it's harder, it's getting easier, but it's, you know, there aren't just like vending machines everywhere with junk food. So, you know, it's maybe less accessible.
Hi, my name's Tim Shower, and I came here because I was really fascinated with Amanda talking about comparing international experiences. I was an exchange student, obviously, years ago, but I'm also a YFU parent. We've hosted international kids.
Right.
And one of the, I guess, things that really bothers me is when people try to make comparisons from European schools to here, or even really schools from around the world, is American schools try, and I would say actually are courageous in trying to educate 100% of our kids. And when
Glad you brought this up. I should have brought this up.
So and I'll say in Northern Europe, I was an exchange student in Germany. We've hosted kids from a couple of countries around Northern Europe. Let's say the word that nobody wants to talk about. They track. There's tracking. We compare our, and as a matter of fact, it really kind of bothered me. You talked about the geography question versus, my daughter's in world history, AP World History last year. She was answering essays all year that were at the level you just discussed about why is it that there's been no peace in the Middle East. So it really,
That's great.
if you compare our AP track
Yeah, let me answer the question.
to the top level track in the world, I think we're very comparable.
Decades ago, other countries did not educate all their kids. That is no longer true. So this test data that I'm talking about today, those countries actually educate a greater percentage of their kids than we do. So it is no longer the case that it's apples to oranges. But I'm glad you asked, because that's something that comes up a lot, and I should have preemptively addressed it. At this point, we have a slightly smaller percentage of our 15-year-olds enrolled in school than the top performing countries, most of them in the world. Shanghai, China, I do not talk about, partly because I do not trust the data, the countrywide data on that. I don't think they have 100% of their kids enrolled in, but this is a complicated other issue. But that's why I don't use that data, right? But the countries I do talk about, Finland, South Korea, Poland, Canada, Australia, those countries, I mean, there are now 20-some countries that have higher high school graduation rates than we do as a percentage of all their kids. Okay, so that is no longer an issue. They educate their special ed kids, they educate their other kids, they educate all their kids. Some countries do it better. Finland is a model in special ed. Korea is worse than the US on special ed, I would say. So there's variance. But we're all trying to educate all our kids around age 15 through high school, right? And other countries are doing that better at this point. As to tracking, I'm so glad you asked, because I too thought that we didn't track. I was very proud of us for this reason. It turns out that we do track earlier and more aggressively than almost any developed country in the world. And we do it in a much more stealthy way than Germany. By the way, Germany's changed a lot, obviously, and they've reduced their tracking. Because what they've learned all over the world is the later you wait to track kids, to literally separate them and have them learn different content based on their perceived ability or interest, the better all kids do. So tracking is something that we do very early. Bill Schmidt has written a lot of great research on this. But just as an example, not only do we do gifted and talented, which doesn't exist in Japan. I mean, that would be like, what does that even mean? Because it assumes that your math ability is innate, right? Which is nonsense and destructive. But then we go to honors, which go to AP, right? I mean, Tom's school in Pennsylvania that I showed you had 3 tracks when he started there, his high school. There was, and a lot of schools do, right? It had the AP track, and then it had the regular track, and then it had the applied track. That is craziness in this economy to have those tracks like that. So they just recently got rid of the applied track, and everybody was worried, and some of the teachers and parents were opposed, and it was fine. The sky didn't fall, no one dropped out because there wasn't English in the workplace anymore, whatever that is. And so what we know is that all the kids should be in your daughter's class.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the longer you wait to divide kids, the better it goes. I'm not saying there shouldn't be a rigorous vocational track. That's awesome. And a lot of these countries do that better than we do, but they wait till age 16 before they divide it, and the vocational track is serious business.
And I think I failed to mention that that 7-continent question actually occurred in a pre-AP world geography class. Over here, really?
So with the idea of balancing like basic skills and learning how to apply your knowledge and think critically, how do you see project-based learning and cross-curricular environments fitting into that?
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of self-directed learning. I think that's compelling. I mean, like so many of these things, it seems to depend on the execution, right? It's sort of, to the degree we can teach kids to take initiative and be invested in their learning, then obviously that's awesome. And they're going to need to take initiative and be self-motivated to thrive all their lives in a way that, you know, older generations of Americans did not need to do. So that's incredibly important and getting more important. But it really depends on how you do it, right? And whether you're able to do that and still have a pretty rigorous level of learning, right? And not let that slip. So I'm kind of an old school about like, you know, let's get the basics right, and then we can go off and do this cool, like, you know, I'm going on an adventure thing. But if you have really well-supported, well-trained teachers who could do that from the beginning, then that would be awesome, I guess, right? I mean, I think people here probably are, so some people in the room have more expertise in this than I do. So I should probably stop talking.
Next question.
Travels in your research, did you have a chance to compare contrast salaries, teacher salaries,
Oh, great question.
and maybe living standards, and maybe the presence of monetary compensation and that is tied to the learning objectives?
Oh, great question. Salaries. So there's 2 very different answers to this. The first answer is if you look at teacher salaries around the world and adjust them for purchasing power parity, so like you can buy the same like basket of goods and rent and whatever, roughly, realizing that's hard to do in the US because there's a lot of variance. What you see is that American teachers are paid relatively well, believe it or not, that our starting elementary teachers rank 5th in the world for their salary. But the problem is we are not competing with Singapore and Italy for teachers. We are competing within the US for teachers. And by that measure, we do not do well. So if you look at how our teachers are paid relative to other professionals in the US, we do not compete well. And there are 2 problems with that, right? One is the obvious. I mean, if, you know, part of the problem is in Finland, doctors and lawyers and bankers don't get paid what they get paid here, right? So one solution would be to pay them less here. I think I would argue that might be a good solution, which is happening actually very slowly, not for bankers, but everybody else. And so that's one thing. And the other, so we're having, we're having to compete with these guys, which is really hard. And the other problem with it is it's a sign of respect in this country. I mean, more so than in Finland, probably. So that is a huge challenge. After looking at all the different ways you can try to elevate a teaching profession and inject prestige and make it serious and get the respect of parents and the public and politicians and kids, I'm now convinced that the best way to do this is to focus much of your energy on education colleges and make them much more selective and much more rigorous and hands-on in their training. And selective doesn't mean you would only accept people with a 3.2 GPA or high SAT scores. I think there are actually smarter ways to be selective that don't necessarily just relate to grades, although I think obviously that's important. The point is, right now in Finland, getting into education college is as hard as getting into MIT. They're accepting 5 to 10% of applicants. And the thing about that is, I think there are plenty of people who aren't getting in who could be great teachers. But the thing about it that's so powerful is that everyone knows, right? So everyone knows how hard it is to be a teacher in Finland. So you get this cascading kind of implications where people are buying into the system, they're respecting teachers. It's easier to make the case for paying them more money and giving them more autonomy because it is so serious and hardcore from the beginning. Not like once they're already in the classroom, but from the beginning, you're really giving them very, very substantive tactical help, and they have a year of student teaching with experienced, effective teachers where they debrief after every lesson and they get very blunt feedback. And that kind of coaching is the one thing we know, can actually work when it's strong. So I think that is an area for improvement in the US. As far as pay for performance, there are some countries that have experimented with that. That is not the case in Finland. There's a little bit of this happening in Korea. I should say in Finland's vocational high schools, they have gone to pay sort of performance bonus to try to attract more teachers to vocational schools, which has, they have really boosted up their vocational schools, and now the university track high schools are really competing to keep their kids, because these vocational schools, are like direct pipelines to good jobs. So we are definitely the most aggressive in trying to use student test scores to evaluate teachers, even though it's still not most teachers are not evaluated this way. Even in DC where I live, and it's been around for several years, only 15% of the teachers have value-added data because they're not in tested subjects. But we are much more aggressive on that.
Yeah, so you were talking about higher ed and teacher education. And you probably may have already followed this, but there's a huge debate in the state right now whether we're going to raise the entrance GPA to teacher ed programs from 2.5 to 2.75. That's kind of low.
2.75, yeah.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. The objection I hear most often in the US to doing that, so in the 1960s, Finland had ed schools kind of like ours, like a varying quality and selectivity all over the country. We educate twice as many teachers as we need in 1,400 different colleges of education, some of which are great, some of which are not. And so this is really an industry for higher ed. It's a very lucrative industry, and it's not very coherent or targeted. So the objection I usually hear in the US is if we do this, we're going to end up with a less diverse teaching force, which is the last thing we need. We already have too homogenous of a teaching force. However, this is where we have to be careful about our fears, right? The evidence doesn't support that will necessarily happen. It depends on the execution, right? So when Rhode Island raised its cut scores to be the highest in the country, which still isn't that high, they were worried about this. And, in fact, the percentage of minority teachers in training went up slightly. Still too low, but it didn't go down. So it depends on, many ed schools are already not very creative and intrepid in recruiting minorities.
Yeah.
So, to then just use this as an excuse and say we can't raise the GPA is a little convenient.
Yeah. Next question.
Good morning. The information that you presented today brings to mind the Common Core state standards. You know,
We're just hitting all targets here. This is great.
I've been studying them, and you know, my understanding is that they're research and evidence-based, internationally benchmarked. Specifically, like with math, they're talking about focus and narrowing down the number of standards so that teachers can go deeper and higher in their order thinking skills and in their instruction. My thought also, I would like to know what you think about that based on your research, as well as were the countries that you studied, did they have all the same standards throughout the whole country? Or did it vary like it does in America? And just what your thoughts are.
Yeah, that's great. I'm so glad you brought this up. These are great questions. So, it is hard to find an education superpower country that does not have a common core of standards. That is all over the world considered a relatively easy way to inject more rigor and coherence and focus into the system. Now, that said, it's not enough, right? I mean, it depends on what you do with it, right? Like, it depends on how well teachers are supported and trained and given time to learn the new standards, and how good the curriculum is, and whether the tests are aligned, and whether everything's aligned. So it depends on many, many things. But yeah, I mean, the evidence from around the world is very, very clear on the value of coming up with a list of clearer, more coherent, deeper learning targets for what kids should know. We are fighting about them, as you know, in 40-some states, in reading and math only. But in Finland and most of these countries, they have them in every subject, you know, like from home ec to phys ed to history. And they're very clear. The Finland's Ministry of Education has their standards up on their website in English, if you're ever curious, and they're much more extensive. They've gotten less prescriptive over the years, but they're still similar to the Common Core. And every 10 years they rewrite them, and it's controversial, and you know, they're living documents in every country, as they should be. And I think that's something that, you know, we should think about for the US. Like, can we make this a more inclusive process with teachers and the public the next time we write the Common Core? Is that possible, and will that help appease some of the very real concerns that people have?
Melissa.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Adrian Wright, and I'm from Texas Southern University. I'm a student in the educator program. And what we're learning right now is that play and fine arts are very important to the curriculum. And I wanted to know, how was that addressed in the countries that you went to?
Yeah, that's another good question. The first answer is unsatisfying, which is there's not like good data on play, right? Like, I wish there were. That would be awesome. There is anecdotally some evidence that that some other countries allow more time for kids, younger kids in particular, to play. I think in these other countries, what tends to happen is there are high stakes for kids with tests at the end of high school, but in elementary school, things are very chill. Even in Japan, the teachers are still really well trained, but so they're really trying to get to these higher order skills and non-cognitive skills like self-control and optimism and curiosity and empathy and all these things, but they're not doing it through a lot of pressure on kids or like long days in the classroom. Finland is the classic example. I'm sorry to keep bringing this up, but with recess, they're the classic example. This is a country where in elementary school you have recess for 15 minutes every hour. And it's a behavior management tool of teachers. But what I love about it is they do it all year long. Do you know how cold it is? In my kids' school, in DC public schools, if it's below 32, they don't go out. I'm all, what are you, crazy? And they say, well, if kids don't bring hats, and I'm like, you know, we have a lost and found bin full of hats and gloves, and you know, I will wash them. But let these kids run around. This is crazy. So then you get back to this point about we think kids are fragile in some ways, and then when they turn 18, you know, all bets are off. But we think kids are very fragile when they're little, and so we don't always let them play. And some of that's because of we have a lot of standardized testing, and you know, that's the one lever our federal government's able to push, and so we pushed it over and over like a crack addict. You know, we just keep doing this. And so that, of course, you know, as you know, leads to less focus on fine arts and play. But again, even on music and art, it's hard to find good data, so I'm in the world of anecdote, unfortunately.
This gentleman gets the last question.
So I'm really interested, I've seen recently there just seems to be a lot more attention being given to public education, just on a national scale. As a writer, I'm really interested in hearing what you think about how beneficial that increased attention is, especially with discussions like Common Core and teacher tenure and unions and all that, and how you think it can really be improved.
Yeah, that's a good one. You know, hindsight is always easy, but looking back and looking around the world, it does seem like the way the reforms we've taken on have been very divisive given the return. Like, if you have something you know is going to have huge gains for all kids, let's bring on the fight. Let's do it. But if you don't know, then let's try to do something that we know brings gains for all kids. Like, I wish one state would really get serious about teacher training, you know, and make that rigorous and tell the story. So you talk about the public. Part of this is, if you're going to make teacher training serious, for real, you need to tell the public, or else you're not really converting it into respect. So you need to tell that story. In the 1980s, Finland's union, teachers union, ran a billboard that said one sentence. It said, "Finland has the best educated teachers in the world." Full stop. Think about the power of that. And think if you could just do one state that could say, we have the best educated teachers in America. So, you know, people say, when I ask policymakers and politicians, why haven't you done this? They say, oh man, you don't know. I mean, if you think dealing with the unions on tenure is hard, higher ed is like a whole nother beast. I'm not sure I'm buying that, but that could just be naivete. But I just feel like, really? It's harder than tenure? You know, so I don't know. I feel like there are ways that we know lead to gains, like standards. Despite all the fighting, that is actually maybe a fight worth having. Maybe we could have done it differently. I don't know, but it's a fight worth having. Improving ed school is a fight worth having. Distributing resources more equitably is a fight worth having.
Do you think Massachusetts, as a state, has probably done it better
Yes.
than any other state?
Yes.
Right. So if there was a state to look at,
Yes, I would. Instead
which
of
is
going
really
to
hard
Finland,
for Texas to do, by the way.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's,
To
you
look
don't
at
have to go to
Massachusetts.
Finland. Like, you could go to Massachusetts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's been a fight. By the way, that was controversial. That was not easy.
Yeah. Paul Rebel
Yeah.
talks a lot about that.
I think he was burned in effigy at one
Yeah.
point. Like,
Yeah.
it's not.
Yeah.
It's hard.
We're up on time. Let's thank Amanda Ripley.